Hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Stephanie Garey, one of the presenters here at GDS Group. Here on our podcast, Strategy for Breakfast, the most important meal of the day. And I'm very excited today. We have a fantastic guest with us. We have Mark Adams here, Senior Vice President and Head of Innovation at Vice Media, here to tell us about all things with a particular focus on what every brand's most powerful technology is. We're really excited. Before I jump in and say hi, don't forget to subscribe, share, like this podcast. Do feel free to email us as well, podcast@gdsgroup.com. We would absolutely love to hear from you. But let's get to it then. Hello and welcome to the podcast, Mark. How are you?
Hi, Stephanie. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, no, I'm really good. Thank you. I was super excited to talk to you.
Likewise.
I've been waiting a long time for this. What feels like a long time. Feels like Christmas morning.
We have been trying to get this in, haven't we? But we got there. We did get there.
We did. Thank you so much for squeezing us in. I know it's fairly late for you right now, but we're pretending it's breakfast time for everyone listening.
Definitely breakfast time.
Yeah, exactly. This is how Mark has his breakfast.
Yeah.
Well, brilliant. So, you know, we've got so much to talk about and what feels like very little time. So I'm keen to just get right to it. So I got this really amazing, quite creative, quite extra bit of synopsis from you, Mark. You know, since the days of the Oracle of Delphi, the most powerful technology in the history of war, society and business has been foresight and prediction. And it goes on. It's fantastic. But
I definitely got on a plane after a few wines, I'm sure. Yeah.
That's when the best stuff happens.
Absolutely.
So go on then. Tell us where's this all kind of come from? What's the message you want to get across?
I think, there's this, Mark Ritson has a great point that I think he says sometimes we're embarrassed to be marketeers, and, I literally studied human rights law and was trying to be a human rights barrister. Probably best for the world that didn't happen. But so I think like a lot of us, I'm kind of trying to find some higher meaning in this wonderful world that we inhabit. Though I love it dearly, and just seeing the passing of Dan Wyden this weekend, just shows you that there are absolute heroes in this industry, and I'm super proud to be part of it. But like everyone, I'm searching for meaning, and I'm sure all of you listening are too. And I think sometimes I just think to myself, what's the game above the game? If the game is, going to shoot me now, if the game is just essentially hypnotizing people with reach and frequency and efficient CPM, right? Hopefully there's something more to strategy, and hopefully that it hasn't all been found out. I'm a massive believer that the fundamentals of marketing are the fundamentals of marketing, and therefore, they are first principles, and they will probably not change. But I think that as new opportunities arise, we should be able to push things further. And my kind of obsession, and a little bit, this has been, partly as a result of being at Vice, which I think is uniquely placed to have this type of kind of inquiry, is about predicting the future. So, and look, everybody will tell you that it's the biggest fool's errand of all time. Like anyone who tried to, I definitely predicted that, Hillary Clinton was going to win, and I definitely predicted that we would never go Brexit, and all these things, right? But actually,
same here.
Yeah, exactly, right. And actually, I do think if you open your consciousness to a different type of kind of analysis, I've tried, at least in the past few years, to kind of pull on the threads that actually do lead somewhere very interesting. And I think I just thought it'd be fun to share them, to be honest with you, and see what the audience thinks. And I'm sure some of them will think it's ridiculous, and some of them will hopefully think it's interesting.
Oh, no, I'm sure they are all interesting. Well, I know you've got a few steps for this. So wondering, where do you kind of begin in this journey? It's always the hardest part, they say.
Yes, absolutely. Well, look, I'm sitting in a studio right now, which is obviously it's morning time. But if there was any doubt that I am a failed DJ and music producer, let there be no doubt that I am a failed music producer. I mean, first of all, you can tell that because I have an Essex accent, and everybody from Essex is a failed DJ. But one of the things that I kind of, was very, very fortunate to just be at university at the exact moment when kind of, let's call it Web 2, really swept, through all of our lives, right? And, built some of the biggest companies in the history of the world. And unfortunately, not much we can do about that now. I was very utopian about it at the time. And like everybody, I'm a little disappointed in how it all ended up. But one of the most interesting things was that, in a nutshell, what was really clear to me, and it felt, again, a bit like a first principle, was that the internet, I mean, this is so simple, but I feel like it's so simple that it's invisible. The internet, the clue's in the name, right? It's an interconnected set of networks, right? And so what you start to realize is, and I think that as marketeers, a child would know that the tax that we pay to be in the internet is the interruption of advertising, right? Even a kid knows that. Like, there is a button that skips our whole industry. Do you know what I mean? Right?
Yeah.
And if we're not careful, by the way. And that's not to say that there's amazing people and amazing work being done that's true and amazing brands. But, you're either in the internet or you're on the internet. And what I mean by on the internet is the original internet, the interconnected set of networks, they were not demographically defined, right? It was basically, or if you go back to, I urge anybody who's just interested in this to go back and just Google Bill Gates, Letterman. And you see Bill Gates explaining to Letterman what the internet is in like 91 or something. It's kind of hilarious. And Letterman says to him, but Bill, like, what the hell am I going to do on this thing? Bill Gates is like,
it's never going to last.
Yeah, right. And Bill Gates is like, well, you get to meet people who are into the same things as you. And he's like, I don't want to do that. Like, I've got enough friends, all the kind of natural, I guess, objections you probably would have had in those days. And Bill Gates says something really, really, I think, quite profound. He says, yeah, but Dave, like, you can't meet someone in Shanghai who likes the same thing as you do. And that seems so glib, but it's so strategic, because what the internet did was essentially remove time and space and allowed us to connect. And here's the most important thing, culturally, around our passions, values, hobbies, the stories that mean things to us, the myths that generate meaning for us. And if I'm honest, brands then did what brands always do, which is they pollute systems, right? Mostly. Well, that's true. But I mean, 90% of branding is marketing is pollution, right? And what they basically did was the kind of the Faustian pact was brands will interrupt this internet by being on it, right? What I mean by that, they build ad systems on top of the internet. So if you go back to the original days of Facebook, Dustin and Mark were basically trying to convince brands to be in the networks and be, contribute and play a part in these cultural networks, these passion-driven networks, right? But brands don't know, because they're 75 years deep into a model that says this is what you do: key visual, 90-second spot, blast, put billboards up and put it into some press, and that was the model. And unfortunately, we couldn't, as digital people, in brands, we couldn't convince the leaders of the brands at the time that actually interruption was probably not going to, on the long enough time frame, be, or put it this way, it would eventually end in structural decline, which it is, right? And so that's why TV is still as powerful as it is. TV is an unbelievably powerful medium. But so long story short, like, step number one is realizing that there's kind of on the internet, which is the ad systems that you can buy demographically. And then there's in the internet. And in the internet, it's really kind of free of demographics. Like, people don't define themselves by how old they are and their net worth and where they live. Like, they literally are. I'm part of some geeky as hell music producer groups, and I'm chatting to a kid from Canada and a guy from there, and this guy's 75 and this kid's 19, And so what the internet really did was that. And so my first step was just the acknowledgement that the internet is an interconnected set of networks, and that those networks have, and this would be step two to just jump into it, those networks create network effects, right? And so Byron Sharp wrote a classic book of our time, and I think that he should be deeply respected for writing that book. And obviously, the book was how brands grow, and it's undeniably a myth buster and a very powerful and scientifically proven canon of work. But his kind of rather quite kind of tongue-in-cheek tagline was "What marketeers don't know," and like I might hasten to add that what marketeers still don't know, even the ones that have read Byron Sharp backwards and forwards, is that there is this things called network effects. Like if you go to Sequoia Capital or Andreessen Horowitz or any of the major VCs in Silicon Valley, and you say to them that you have a business that's built on a powerful brand and scale and media dollars, they will not invest in you because that's an industrial era business model. The only way you're going to get investment is that you can show that you can pulse and activate networks and create network effects. And what I mean by that is people, not media, do the job partly for you. So before you get to blasting the big red pay button, actually the audience that you're attaching to do a lot of the work for you. And I learned this working at William Morris Endeavor, the biggest talent agency in the world. And we were building Lady Gaga, and we were building, Hugh Jackman and Charlize Theron on these platforms. And we weren't using paid media. Do you know what I mean? And we were becoming way bigger than all of Unilever's brands combined in just one of those properties. And what I kind of realized was that brands kind of hadn't really figured out that there's this thing called on the internet and there's this thing called in the internet. And being on the internet is really, my dad's Scottish and he's got an unfortunate Shrek accent, and he says, it's a hiding to nothing. And it basically means you get the shit beaten out of you and no good comes of it. And I kind of feel like that's a little bit like marginal returns of like trying to get and interrupt people. And what's happening is more and more of the world, more and more of the universe that we call digital space and therefore culture, even in real life, is ad-free. So, try putting an ad in Fortnite. It's hard. Like, try putting an ad, try interrupting my Amazon Prime viewing tonight. You won't be able to. So more and more, we're starting to realize that, there was less and less, there's less and less places for brands to be visible and valued, basically. So anyway, nutshell, step one, identify the fact that there's an internet and it's got, interconnected networks. And then step two, look for where there are network effects. And almost I think of network effects as they're kind of like waves coming into shore. Some of them are little, they're just little network effects and nothing to be worried about. Some of them are pretty big, like veganism. That's a pretty big network effect. And it's not powered by paid media. It's powered by a network creating effects and bringing more people into that vortex. They're literally recruiting more people. They're moving into new networks and infecting those. And I mean, Corona taught us this, right? That is literally the lesson of Corona. And so I feel like brands are still scratching their head trying to figure this one out. So I think the first two steps are understanding the internet, basically, and then secondly, understanding what a network effect is and understanding that network effects are essentially creating culture all around us all the time.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a bit of the wild, wild west out there, isn't it? Just go back to kind of what your dad says about the internet. It's just so no one really understands what's happening still. And it's so interesting. While you were talking, I was thinking about all of both the positives and the negatives of that. The world's become a smaller place, mostly for the better. Lots of movements that I find, positive, getting bigger and bigger. But then there's also the kind of uglier side of it that, the movements that I and probably a lot of people would agree are not a positive move unless you're the one in them. And, I don't want to get bogged down into the discussion of that. That's a whole other podcast that would be really interesting, actually. But it's just you can't. Well, can you control it? Or, what's step 3? What comes after this?
It's actually really important to analyze this as things because I think that brand builders believe that there's the boardroom reality and then they walk outside and they kind of switch their brain into another reality and they're like, do you know what I mean? But they don't, it's almost like we get less intelligent when we walk into the boardroom or we forget what we inherently know. And look, just to kind of riff on your point, like millions of people globally now believe in QAnon. Like millions.
Yeah.
Like the most unlikely and improbable fiction of madness you've ever heard. That a cabal of blood drinking celebrities and the Queen, like it's mental.
Yeah,
right?
I know.
But this has happened because a
Yeah.
network of people created an effect. That effect created a further effect, and that has rippled throughout this whole thing, which is a whole set of networks, and lots of those networks are getting infected. And if you look at it, there was a great article, and I'm sorry to tell you this one, Yoga People, but it said that, you know, the biggest, and so what happens when a network infects another network is, you know, when you started realizing like the biggest anti-vaccinators in the world are the same wellness practitioners that go on the yoga retreats, right? So this is a crazy, like coming together of high and low culture. So the same, like, you know, people who are like, oh yeah, like I'm super healthy and like, you know, I don't try not to do this, I'm a vegan. So they're also like, yeah, no, COVID was invented by Bill Gates, funny enough. And so this is what I mean by a network having an effect on another network, right? And ideas, that's culture. That's how culture moves. So I guess step 3 is realizing that one of the best things about networks, and by the way, you can call networks communities if you like. I like to call them networks because I think that for the reason that I'm about to explain, I think that communities is a soft and a kind of emotionally kind of poised word, but network is an extremely mathematical and scientific word. So, you know, a network can be measured. A network has nodes. Those nodes have interactions. The frequency of those interactions can be measured. You know, we talk a lot Vice about 3-star networks. What I mean by that is there's a density to that network. I'm not going to bore you with this, but, you know, basically, how do you know someone's in your network? You know that someone's in your network because you disproportionately engage with them as against the average, right? So it's almost like if you and I, we've met once or twice, right? But if we start, God forbid for you, frequently engaging, that shows that we are now upping our frequency of engagement as against, say, somebody you just met another time, right? So this is how networks begin, and that's the density effect. And then you've got the idea that, you know, there's clustering. So what that means is there's kind of optimal sizes for networks until they kind of actually start to break down. So it's fascinating this. I'll give you an example. Electronic music is a perfect example. Electronic music was one genre, and to many people, I'm sure it still is. But, you know, actually, when you get into that network, you realize there's techno and there's house, and they're not very similar. And there's drum and bass and dubstep, and they're not very similar. And then there's, you know, 100 different genres really within that. And so that's the clustering effect. And it's almost like the Russian dolls. You open a network, you get more networks, right? And so what I started to kind of become
that's a good analogy.
You know, what I started to become obsessed with this idea that, you know, there's, and by the way, the third one is virality rate, right? Which is, I don't even like to say that word because it reminds me of it gives me shivers of the early 2000s of people saying, can you make this go viral? But, you know, what I mean by that is that, you know, these 3 things is what I call a 3 network. You know, that's what makes a network a very powerful thing. And so if you can start to, you know, get acquainted with those ideas, at least you can start to then say, and by the way, all of the technology exists to be able to do this. Like you can 100% go and find providers and suppliers that can do this for you. And Vice, I think, does it extremely well. We are very data rich. Of course, we're one of the biggest, you know, youth media publisher in the world. And I think we genuinely know how to use what we're putting out in the world to get data to tell us where things are going next. And so in the end, you know, what you start to realize is that any network that has those 3 things should be respected and or feared. Anything. So if you're Nestle and you dismiss veganism, and someone who has the awareness can realize that the vegan network has all 3 of those things, it's clustered, it's dense, and it has a virality effect, someone needs to start paying attention to veganism very quickly. Because otherwise, all of your points of sale in 5 or 6 years, exactly what happened, right? Tesco's and all the big suppliers start saying, you know what? we're thinking about changing it up at the checkout stores. Actually, we're going to go with this kind bar, and so then literally
Yeah.
you're a thing of the past, right? And you have to M&A your way out of that problem. So this is the thing, and I think that the mathematics of this is amazing, because anything that's doubling in effect, anything that's doubling, it doesn't matter. I always come back to the alien in Alien, right? When the alien comes out, it's not that big. It's kind of about as big as my cat, basically. It is obviously scary to burst out of someone's stomach, but in and of itself, you're like, oh, that's horrible. But it's not that big,
Yeah,
but
it's just a cat.
by the end of the film, which I assume is, only a few days, it's quite big. It's pretty damn big, right?
Spoiler alerts.
I can't tell you the number of times as Vice we've been in rooms telling people, guys, this is going to be big. And they're like, thanks, Vice. Bring in the consultant, bring in the network agency. And of course, the opportunity either bypasses them, which is sad enough, but even more sad is the opportunity slams into them like a tidal wave that they didn't see coming and absolutely decimates their market share.
Yeah.
I've seen it so many times.
Yeah. Listen to Vice, guys.
No, I'm not saying listen to Vice. I'm just saying what I say is be conscious of other life, right? Be cool, conscious of other life. Like, your first job as a marketer in the digital age is to understand the networks that make up the internet. Try and analyze which of those are what we call a very active network, and which of those have those three effects, and which are growing and which are exponentially growing. Because the best way to predict the future, as COVID showed us, is an exponential growth rate, right? If there's 2 cases today and 4 tomorrow and 8 the next day and 16 the day after and 32 the day after that, it's time to start worrying. You know?
Definitely.
And
maybe this is a really entry level question. Maybe people listening at home are like, we know this stuff, but for my benefit, how does one go about finding out if it is those 3 things? Just deep diving Google.
No. I mean, look, that's where you have to, I think you have to, how I said you have to be cool, conscious of other life. I think the next step is to be what I would call edgy. And I don't mean edgy as in edgy. I mean, like, we always talk about this idea that early detection guarantees yield. So it's like, you're not ever going to see it early enough, right? It's just, it's never going to happen unless you're, maybe if you're like the research lab at Nike, maybe, right? But most of the time, you want to be able to see it. And by the way, you don't even want to invest in it too early. Like, if I was going to invest in craft beer, I wouldn't have invested in craft beer in 1995. I would have invested in, if I was ABI, I would have started getting into craft beer in 2002. As it was, craft beer completely bypassed ABI, and they had to buy Camden Hell's brewery for $6 billion in, I think, 2012 or something, right? So there's another example of the tidal wave came. By the time anybody had realized, nobody was able to clear the beach and they got slammed, right? Yeah. So I would say that, you don't want to go too early. Equally, you don't want to be like my mum, who just found out about Banksy and thinks he's going to be big, right? So, and I feel like, it's amazing. I love her so much.
Well, we're based in Bristol. Send her over. I can show her some of the lesser known Banksies,
Oh, come on. But, and this is so clear when you work in the world of entertainment as we do, right? Because, look, we won 10 Emmys on Thursday night, right? So we are literally, we're like 3-footed being. 1 foot is in pure entertainment, making stuff for Netflix, making stuff for Amazon Prime, etc. And others are media business. We're making, putting 2,000 articles out a week in 27 different languages across the world. And then we work with brands. And it's so interesting to see that despite everything we know as an entertainment business, we cannot get, and maybe it's not right to try and force them to, but the original sin of every brand is they come to you and say, so we're looking for 31 to 36-year-old males in these 3 markets. And you're like, there's no network effects in that. It's what I call a Zen network. It's got zero effect network, right? It just doesn't, there's no such thing as like a group of 31 to 36-year-old people in these 3 markets that feel connected to each other by something.
Yeah.
So ironically, brands kind of admit that when they proxy through things like sport and music, right? But so it's interesting.
Yeah. Amazing. And then is there that kind of fifth and final magical step getting us to the oasis? What's the big reveal?
So I guess the step one was, yeah, exactly. Step one was just, understand that the internet is an interconnected set of networks. And it's not just the internet, right? Culture is now an interconnected set of networks, right? Because those people that met on the internet want to meet in real life now as well, even the bad ones. And then the second step, I guess, would be, understand what a network effect is. And if I could be as bold as to, say this, I would say that if the marketing community truly understood network effects, we would be in a lot more respected positions in the C-suite. If you there's a great book called The Cold Start Problem. It's written by one of the VCs at Andreessen Horowitz that invested in Uber. And, Uber understood that their business was a network, right? It was very literally a network. Absolutely, and they understood that their job was to create more network effects than all their competitors. So that would be number two. And then number three would be, velocity growth rate, I would call it, like how fast, or even better than that, how exponentially is something growing? Is this network growing? And if it's growing, it's definitely worth paying attention to. I'm not saying you should invest in it, but I'm just saying be aware of it, be conscious of it, especially if it could potentially impact you. So if you're Philip Morris and CBD oil is getting big, you should probably think about that.
Yeah.
If your ABI and craft beer is getting big, you should probably think about that, right? If you're Estee Lauder and Real Beauty is a movement and Dove are starting to get ahead of it way before you should probably think about that, right? So and then I guess the final step of this would be, the final step is classic marketing. It's understand, and this is an editorial question. It comes down to understanding where the equity of the brand that you're currently managing and or the I like to think of you as the kind of the guardian of the brand, right? If you're the agency or the brand leader. And this question comes down to which of these networks, though there may be many that are exponentially growing, gives us power that we don't currently have that we would want. And that could be multiple different things. And I must stress here, this is not necessarily a media question. This is not about targeting that network with advertising and trying to recruit them to the brand, although that is a secondary effect. What I think that's mass generation. I think this is about myth generation. So I mentioned Dove. Dove very cleverly aligned itself and built one of its distinct assets to be the movement of people that you would call Real Beauty, the network, the community, right? Canada Goose very cleverly aligned itself with the community of people who go on film shoots and go out in the morning at 5 a.m. and film Game of Thrones battle scenes, and they're all wearing Canada Goose. And so what you start to realize is that probably one of the most, in fact, the most underrated distinct memory structure or distinct asset that a brand owns is that community that you think of when you first think of that brand. I mean, Apple has done unbelievable amount of work to try and align itself in the millennials era, in my era, with that kind of hipster creative. It doesn't mean that their media doesn't also reach my mum and dad, but the hero of that media is the myth that they built with that community. And so I think because we are children of the age of advertising systems and ad tech and all the nonsense that happened in the past 10 years, we can't but think that everything is ultimately about the media target, as in the mass, when actually brand building is about mass, undeniably. But I think there's a step before that, which is about myth. You've got to create a myth, and you can't create a myth on your own, and your agency can't create it for you with some some character. Like, you can't get Tony the Tiger and create a myth like you used to. The consumer's too savvy. So you have to build
Tony the Tiger, the absolute myth. I love it.
But you know what I mean? If you think about it, it is a myth. Right? It's like, there's a story. There's Tony the Tiger. He's going to do this thing. Nowadays, that just doesn't cut it, man. Like, I always come back to this idea that, like, the community that you're marketing with and the community that you're marketing at. And the answer to the community you're marketing at is, as Byron Sharp correctly says, all potential buyers of the category. That's given now. We don't need to argue about that ever again, right? That is 100% proven. So don't get me twisted. I'm not talking about being niche. I'm not talking about, but I'm saying if you want to go big, start manageably small with a muse audience that you can land a creative punch on, or in my words, a contribution. And then you get to tell the masses the story of what you did with this group. And then maybe you cut through.
Absolutely. Mark, I could sit and talk to you all day. I have so many questions, but I know we're basically out of time. Any last final words of wisdom from the Mark Adams? I mean,
there's no
the brain
here.
must be full of them. I'd love to get some final thoughts.
Oh God, good thing it's the morning. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Go get your coffee.
Honestly, I would just, to summarize, I would just say this. What Byron Sharp gave us, which was so important, it was like absolutely essential, right? Was a grounding that marketing isn't this dismal science that it was before. You know, he uses a brilliant example of, you know, we used to put leeches on people and we used to bleed them when they'd been shot. Like, that was what physicians used to do. They'd be like, oh my God, he's been shot. Quick, get the bucket and the razor and we'll bleed him. It's like, oh my God, right?
Yeah.
And I hate to say this, but, yes, as marketeers, we were guilty of all of that. We really were. And that's why I think that when it comes to mass generation, just read Sharp. He's right. But when it comes to myth generation, which is the second half of your job as a marketeer, I fundamentally believe that earning a story. So we talk about scale a lot at Vice, and we kind of came up with this rather cheesy what do you call it for it, anagram or whatever, where we say scale stands for story communicating a love earned, right? Yeah. So if you want to have scale, yes, you better fucking tell a story about how you earned love, and then scale yourself to sleep, as far as I'm concerned. Hit the big red paid button as much as you like. But if marketing now is just taking some distinct, asset like Coca-Cola Red or whatever it is, and blasting it at scale, count me out. I want to go and be a human rights lawyer again, because that's just not strategic, and it won't work. So I would just say, be in the internet with a group that you think is the right one, that you can build an equity swap with reciprocity of value. They will give you exactly the authenticity and the stories that you can then take to scale. And you will give them contributions that will make them go, wow, I'm now part of this brand and I love it. And I would say just do both. It's not one or the other.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. Everyone, please do that. We can't lose Mark to the law industry. Please do what he says. Well, look, thank you so much, Mark. Going to let you get off with the rest of your day now. There's so much of it left, right?
You're the best.
It's been our absolute pleasure.
And I'm so sorry I was late, by the way, but I just tried to rip through it as fast as possible.
Mark, don't apologise at all. No, we've had a great time. Thank you so much. I'm going to have to get you back on another time, and I would just want to keep talking to you and asking you so many questions. Thank you so much, Mark. And if you've enjoyed this listening at home, which I'm sure you have, please do comment, like, share. I'll put the link to Mark's LinkedIn in the episode notes, so feel free to reach out and connect. And we'll hopefully see you next time. Thanks so much, everyone.